The air in the Grand Nexus arena shimmered with anticipation. Thousands of spectators, aliens of every imaginable species, crowded the tiered stands, their voices merging into a cacophony of excitement. Holographic banners hovered in the air, displaying the combatants, General Zraktal, the undefeated warlord of the Drox Empire, and Commander Ethan Voss, the lone human who dared to accept his challenge. Zraktal stood at the center of the massive, circular combat pit. He was a towering figure, his obsidian scales gleaming under the arena's artificial suns. Jagged ridges ran along his muscular arms, remnants of countless battles. He exuded the raw power of a being sculpted for war. His kind had ruled the battlefield for centuries, unchallenged, unbroken. Yet here across from him stood a human, unarmored, unarmed, and utterly unimpressed. Ethan Voss rolled his shoulders, testing his muscles. He wasn't the largest or strongest fighter to step into this pit, but he had something Zraktal would never understand: adaptability. The Drox were warriors, but they were predictable, bound by rigid codes of combat that had never been questioned. Ethan had spent years studying their kind, learning their patterns, their weaknesses. And now, against all diplomatic protests, he stood face to face with their greatest warrior. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the arena. The Arbiter, a floating construct of sleek metal and pulsing energy, descended between them. This is a duel of honor. No weapons. No interference. Victory is declared upon incapacitation or surrender. Do both parties accept? Zraktal bared his fangs. I will end this quickly, human. Ethan smirked. Let's find out. The Arbiter pulsed, and the match began. Zraktal moved first. He lunged forward with terrifying speed, his claws swiping through the air. Ethan sidestepped, barely avoiding the strike as a gust of displaced wind ruffled his shirt. The crowd roared in approval. The Drox fought with overwhelming force, designed to crush opposition in seconds. Against most opponents, that initial charge was enough. Ethan kept moving. He knew that direct confrontation was suicide. Zraktal swung again, a sweeping blow meant to send him sprawling. Instead, Ethan dropped low, rolling beneath the strike and coming up just behind him. He delivered a precise kick to the back of the knee, exploiting a joint he knew was structurally weaker than the rest of the Drox's body. Zraktal stumbled, snarling. The audience gasped. The warlord turned, slower this time, his reptilian eyes narrowing. He had expected a desperate, flailing human, not an opponent who studied his movements, who attacked with precision. A deep rumble vibrated in his chest, a sound of intrigue and irritation. Ethan remained loose, his stance shifting fluidly. He had spent years in battle, but this was different. This was a performance, a statement. The entire galaxy watched as humanity's worth was decided in real time. He could feel the weight of it, but fear had no place here. Zraktal attacked again, this time more cautiously. He feinted left before twisting right, his claws slicing toward Ethan's ribs. Ethan twisted with him, absorbing the force on his forearm before rolling with the momentum. He was knocked back, but he landed on his feet. That, too, made the audience murmur. No one had ever endured a clean hit from Zraktal and remained standing. The Drox warrior exhaled sharply, recalibrating. You fight like no other. Ethan wiped the blood from his arm, grinning. And you hit like a truck. Zraktal's eyes darkened. He charged again, but this time, Ethan moved to meet him. At the last moment, he spun past him, landing a solid elbow, strike to the side of the warlord's neck. It wasn't enough to do serious damage, but it was enough to prove something. He wasn't just surviving. He was fighting back. The energy in the arena shifted. The spectators, who had once cheered for a quick execution, now watched with growing unease. They had never seen a human in true combat against one of their champions. They had never seen a Drox struggle. Zraktal took a step back, studying Ethan now. His breathing was measured, his stance adjusted. For the first time in his long, storied career, he was being forced to adapt. Ethan could see it happening, the realization beginning to dawn in his opponent's mind. The Drox fought with raw power, with preordained forms that had been passed down for generations. But humans were chaos given form. They learned. They evolved. They refused to fight the way they were expected to. The next move would decide everything. Zrak-Tal lunged with blinding speed, and Ethan met him head-on. Zrak-Tal struck like a meteor, his massive arms sweeping through the air in a blur of motion. Ethan barely managed to shift his weight, ducking under the strike as the force of it sent dust spiraling into the air. A fraction slower, and his skull would have been cracked open like brittle stone. But he wasn't slower. Ethan twisted on his heel, slipping behind the warlord once more. He lashed out with a sharp kick to the back of Zrak-Tal's knee, targeting the same weak point he had struck earlier. This time, the warlord was ready. His leg flexed, absorbing the blow, and with terrifying speed, he spun, claws flashing toward Ethan's chest. Ethan reacted instinctively, falling back into a controlled roll just as Zrak-Tal's claws raked through empty space. He came up in a low stance, breathing steady, mind sharp. The warlord's strength was immense, his speed greater than expected. But there was something else, something that mattered more than brute force. He was predictable. Zrak-Tal had been forged in war, trained in the legendary combat disciplines of the Drox, each movement a perfected strike honed over generations. But perfection was a weakness. Perfection was static. It could be studied, deconstructed, undone. Ethan wiped a thin trail of blood from his arm where a claw had grazed him, then smiled. "You're getting slower." A deep growl rumbled from Zrak-Tal's chest, something between frustration and intrigue. His kind did not take insults lightly, nor did they hear them often. He shifted his stance, coiling like a predator preparing to strike. Ethan knew the warlord was reassessing, trying to adjust. But humans didn't just adjust. They rewrote the rules. Zrak-Tal surged forward, but this time Ethan didn't evade. He met the charge directly, moving inside the warlord's guard. Zrak-Tal's instinct was to crush him with sheer mass, but Ethan was already sliding low, striking the inside of his thigh with a sharp, precise elbow. The Drox stumbled, just for a moment, but long enough for Ethan to capitalize. He leapt upward, driving his knee into Zrak-Tal's ribs. The impact was solid, sending a ripple through the warlord's thick frame. The crowd gasped. No one had ever struck a Drox warlord like that. No one had ever dared. Zrak-Tal staggered back, his reptilian eyes burning with something Ethan had never seen in them before, uncertainty. The warlord exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "You do not fight like the others." Ethan rolled his shoulders, still light on his feet. "You expected me to break, to crumble under the first strike. But humans don't fight for honor. We fight to win." Zrak-Tal's gaze sharpened. He knew what Ethan was saying, even if he didn't want to admit it. The Drox fought with discipline, with tradition, with unwavering belief in their own superiority. Humans fought with something else entirely: instinct, adaptability, and a complete disregard for what was supposed to be possible. The warlord stepped forward again, but now there was a hesitation in his stride. A flicker of caution. Ethan saw it and pressed the advantage. He feinted left, drawing out the expected counterstrike, then pivoted sharply, slipping around Zrak-Tal's defense. His fist slammed into the warlord's side, just beneath the ribs, striking the kidney-equivalent organ Ethan had studied in Drox physiology reports. Zrak-Tal grunted, his body betraying him for the first time. He took a knee. The crowd fell silent. Ethan didn't press the attack. He simply stood there, watching the warlord with careful eyes. Zrak-Tal's breathing was steady, his muscles still coiled with power, but something fundamental had changed. He wasn't just facing a human anymore. He was facing the truth. Zrak-Tal lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Ethan. "You are learning." Ethan smirked. "I already learned everything I needed before I stepped into this pit." The warlord exhaled, slow and deep. His entire life, his entire species, had operated under the assumption that strength was absolute, that discipline was unbreakable. But here, now in this moment, he saw the flaw. Humans weren't the strongest, the fastest, the most durable. But they were the most dangerous, because they refused to stay within the limits of what should be possible. Zraktal rose to his feet, no longer moving with the confidence of an undefeated warrior, but with the careful calculation of someone who had just encountered something beyond their understanding. He took a stance again, but it was different now. The arrogance was gone. Ethan nodded. Now you're starting to get it. The fight wasn't over, but something far more important had just begun. Zraktal shifted his stance, rolling his shoulders as he regarded Ethan with something dangerously close to respect. The arrogance had faded from his eyes, replaced with something colder, sharper. A warrior who had never known uncertainty now stood on the precipice of revelation. The crowd had fallen into an uneasy hush. The arena, once filled with the deafening roars of spectators anticipating another decisive victory, now simmered with an unfamiliar tension. This was not how the battle was supposed to unfold. A human was not supposed to last this long, let alone press an advantage. Zraktal exhaled, slow and controlled. You fight without honor. Ethan smirked, but there was no humor in it. I fight to win. The warlord's claws flexed at his sides. His kind had dominated the battlefield for centuries, their superiority unquestioned. But now, as he studied the man before him, he felt the undeniable weight of truth settling onto his shoulders. Ethan had not won yet, but neither had he fallen. He had done what no warrior before him had done. He had forced Zraktal to doubt. And doubt was a crack in the foundation of certainty. Zraktal moved. This time, there was no reckless aggression, no sweeping strikes meant to crush and overwhelm. He attacked with precision, with measured intent. Ethan recognized the shift immediately. Zraktal was learning. He wasn't just relying on strength anymore. He was adapting. A thrill of recognition pulsed through Ethan's chest. This was it. The moment the warlord crossed the threshold from a creature bound by tradition to something more dangerous. If the Drox learned to evolve, to fight as humans did, the balance of power in the galaxy could shift forever. Ethan met the warlord's charge, weaving between the strikes that came with terrifying speed. But they were different now. The patterns he had memorized, the rhythms he had anticipated, were changing. Zraktal was unpredictable in a way he hadn't been moments ago. Ethan dodged a strike, but felt the wind of a second coming faster than expected. He barely twisted in time, the warlord's claws grazing his side. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but he had no time to acknowledge it. Zraktal pressed forward, relentless, testing, searching for an opening. Ethan pivoted, feinting a retreat before snapping forward. He drove a fist toward the warlord's ribs, but Zraktal twisted with the blow, absorbing it differently than before. The impact landed, but it lacked the same effectiveness. He had adjusted. Ethan gritted his teeth. This was dangerous. Zraktal struck again, faster this time. Ethan managed to sidestep, but he felt the strain building. Humans won fights by outlasting, by adapting faster than their opponents. But what happened when the opponent adapted just as quickly? The warlord's gaze burned with a new understanding. This is why your kind is feared. Ethan let out a short breath. Now you're catching on. Zraktal stepped back, tilting his head. He could have pressed the attack. He didn't. You knew how I would fight before this battle began. You studied me. Ethan didn't deny it. Of course I did. The warlord exhaled slowly. And yet you did not know how I would fight now. Ethan's muscles tensed. That was the truth of it, wasn't it? The Drox had always relied on tradition, on patterns, on the unshakable foundation of their combat philosophy. But now, Zraktal had done something his kind had never done before. He had broken the mold. And that meant the fight was no longer one-sided. The realization settled between them like a drawn blade. The crowd remained silent, waiting, watching. They had expected a battle, but what they were witnessing was something far more profound. Ethan rolled his shoulders, ignoring the dull ache creeping into his ribs. So what happens now? Zraktal was still for a long moment. Then, to the shock of everyone present, he straightened and stepped back. His claws retracted. His battle stance eased. He was no longer fighting. Ethan frowned. You're stopping. The warlord's gaze was unreadable. No, I am conceding. The silence that followed was absolute. The Grand Nexus Arena, a place where the Drox had reigned undefeated, had never once witnessed their champion yield. The very idea was unthinkable. Ethan's heart pounded as he studied the warlord. This wasn't surrender. It was something else entirely. Zraktal inclined his head, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of something far greater than the battle they had just fought. There is no honor in a war that cannot be won. There is only wisdom in knowing when to change. Ethan stared at him, and then slowly he nodded. Because in the end, that was the real victory. Not in breaking the Drox, but in forcing them to evolve.